States can be buried in history, but can a state's history be buried underwater? Russia, in the throes of war, is surrounded by oceans. That's why Russia attaches great importance to its navy. The Russian government claimed to have the most powerful navy in the world, but the war in Ukraine proved the Russian government wrong. And how did this happen? Land and air armies are involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is because there is a very long land border between the two countries. The Russian army had planned to send the ground army to invade Ukraine. However, thanks to the historic resistance of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army suffered a heavy defeat in ground operations. Russian commanders were then forced to try new tactics. Russia and Ukraine are bordering the Black Sea. The Russian army has also deployed the navy to operate in the south. The Russian navy in Crimea set out to bomb Ukrainian ports, but the Ukrainian army was prepared for this operation as a result of the shells fired at Russian ships. The Russian navy suffered heavy damage. Many Russian ships were sunk, the Russian ships that returned to the Crimean harbor. But this move did not save the Russian ships. The Ukrainian army came up with a plan to destroy the Russian ships anchored in the Crimean harbor. Ukrainian army troops flew to this harbor. Ships in the harbor were hit by drones. Ships damaged by drone shells began to sink. The port was also hit during this bombardment. The Crimean harbor caught fire. Russian naval officers tried to save the sinking ships, but without success. They evacuated the Crimean port to prevent other ships from being affected by the fire. As a result of successful operations of the Ukrainian army, 18 warships of the Russian navy were destroyed. Warships are among the most expensive and largest equipment of armies. A warship is equipped with the most advanced weapons missile systems, specialized military software, and a large number of ammunition. As a result of the sinking of the Russian ships, these munitions also sank into the sea. As a result of the sinking of these ships, the Russian military is thought to have lost billions of dollars. Having lost its most powerful ships, Russia realized that it could not continue the naval war in the Black Sea. Moreover, the Russian government does not have the power to buy new ships to replace the sunken ones. The Russian economy has been badly damaged by this war. That's why Russia cannot renew its navy. In this situation, Russian commanders have two options in the Black Sea. The first option is to give up naval warfare altogether. Russian commanders want to implement this decision, but Putin does not allow it. Putin is very adamant about this after the failures of the land army. He thinks that the Russian navy must bomb Ukraine. That's why Russian commanders cannot give up naval warfare. There is only one option left. This option is to bring all the ships of the Russian navy to the Ukrainian harbor. But this is very difficult and costly. Many of the ports of Russia's military ships are completely frozen. The north of Russia is very close to the poles. The ports in these regions are unusable. Most of the year, the Russian navy is usually waiting in eastern ports because the east of Russia is closer to the United States. Some Russian ships are also in the Baltic Sea. These ships are kept in this area against NATO members in Europe. Ships from Russia's eastern ports have to go all the way around the Asian continent to get to the Black Sea. Russia also thinks that this would create a huge security gap in the east. That's why it is being very cowardly about it. Russia has so far sent only 2 warships from these ports, but these ships could not reach the Black Sea much closer to the Black Sea. Russia has warships in the Baltic Sea, but the Baltic Sea is turning into a hell for Russia. After the applications of Sweden and Finland, the Baltic Sea has become a NATO lake. Russian warships are afraid to pass through the Baltic. If Russian warships manage to pass through this sea, they will have to go around the entire European continent. All these countries are NATO members. Russia cannot send these ships to the Black Sea because it is afraid of NATO members. There is another reason why Russia cannot send ships to the Black Sea. As you know, the only access road to the Black Sea is located in Turkey. In order to reach the Black Sea, it is necessary to pass through the Dardanelles and Istanbul Straits. But Turkey, as a NATO member, will never allow Russian warships to pass through these straits. Russia has no presence at sea against NATO. This is leading to a major defeat for the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. At the moment, no commander of the Russian Navy dares to report to Putin about this. However, it is no longer possible for Russian Navy ships to carry out operations against Ukraine. There is another development that frightens Russian commanders. USS Nitsy, one of the most powerful warships of the US, anchored in the Bosphorus Strait, and the whole world was surprised by this gigantic ship sailing into the Black Sea. Moreover, the US ambassador to Turkey, Jeffrey Fleet, visited the ship and met with all the soldiers. It was claimed that this ship was going to sail to Crimea after receiving some NATO weapons in Turkey. But in the meantime, there was a huge earthquake in Turkey, after which a state of emergency was declared in Turkey and a lot of work was stopped. This earthquake happened in southern Turkey. The earthquake occurred in the city of Kahramanmaraş and was felt in 10 cities. One of the cities is Adana. Adana is home to one of the biggest NATO bases. The NATO base in Adana is one of the biggest threats for Russia because the planes taking off from this base have a very close range to bomb Moscow. Russia is very afraid of the presence of this base. An earthquake around the NATO base took everyone by surprise when the US ship arrived in Turkey. Russian submarines are known to conduct many seismic surveys and secret projects in the Black Sea. Some sources in the Turkish press claim that Russian submarines in the Black Sea are energizing fault lines using nuclear energy. According to earthquake experts, external interventions can also be made to cause an energy explosion in fault lines. It is thought that Russia is using nuclear energy to cause these fault lines to break, but there is no concrete information on this yet. The statements made by a deputy in Russia surprised everyone. Duma deputy Yevgeny Fedorov made an interesting statement on this issue. Fedorov said that he suspected that this earthquake was artificial. Fedorov's statements were almost like a confession for Russia. Immediately after the earthquake, Turkish warships started to carry out many investigations in the Black Sea. However, no concrete evidence has been found so far. It is claimed that the CIA is also conducting a research on this issue. NATO bases in Turkey were not destroyed in this earthquake. According to investigations at a NATO base in Adana, these buildings are still intact. The weapons in the bases are expected to be loaded onto the US ship as soon as possible. After this loading, the US warship can go on an operation to destroy the Russian Navy. The whole world is wondering about the US plan. What do you think about the heavy defeat of the Russian Navy? Do you think the Baltic Sea countries will join NATO? What do you think about Russia's military presence in the Black Sea? What do you think the US ship in Istanbul will do? Do you think the earthquake in Turkey could have been caused by Russia? The sounds of ambulances began to echo in the Kremlin. Putin's illness has hit hard this time. However, the Ukrainian army now has the upper hand. The Russian people have begun to claim with great anxiety that Putin is no longer able to govern them. Tensions on the streets of Moscow have reached a fever pitch, with Putin's policies have resonated around the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been the sole power in Russia for nearly 30 years. Although many bad decisions have been made during this period, Putin, who supposedly enjoys popular support, continues his oppressive rule in many areas. But recent developments have shown that Putin's illness has reappeared. This has been a matter of great fear, both in the Russian army and among Putin's supporters, because Putin's illness will bring with it a very big problem. As it is known, Putin spent his youth in the KGB, where he received very heavy training. During this period, it is known that Putin had a severe illness, such as pneumonia, and came back from the brink of death. Although Putin survived as incident, this disease never left him in the future because on the stage on as long he was left with a very big problem with the advancement of his age. This disease recurred again. And according to the information learned by our sources in the Kremlin, the ambulances coming to this region took one person and left. While this information had a great echo all over the world, it once again showed the whole world how troubled Putin's health was. Putin's behavior, especially in recent live broadcasts, has been noticed by war analysts and many figures. It was determined that Putin, who is now much more irritable than before, sometimes cannot control his hands and legs, so the broadcasts were interrupted early. The situation strengthened the possibility that Putin may have Parkinson's disease, which is especially common in former boxers and combat sports athletes. The real problem was that the pro-Putin agencies tried to hide it. But no matter how hard they try, Putin is now at a huge disadvantage against Ukraine. His erratic and angry moves only encourage more people to support Ukraine. In the aftermath of this situation, the Ukrainian army has now reached a point where it is on the verge of victory, and the Russian media has begun to focus on something so different. Putin's treacherous plan has been revealed. Putin revealed the fact that the war in Ukraine was at a point where it could be lost in the propaganda films he showed to his citizens. With this, it became clear once again how much superiority the Ukrainian army has over the Russians. Although Putin is constantly making moves to destroy this portrait of a sick man, the Russian people are now very uncomfortable with this situation, and he decided to organize a huge protest against it. Attendance at Putin's rallies in Russia has dropped considerably in recent days, but the other factor that attracts attention is Putin's mysterious stunt doubles. According to sources in the Kremlin, it has been revealed that there are about 8 names that Putin uses as body doubles. These people take part in Putin's rallies and are responsible for keeping the secrets of Putin, who has been unable to stand up in recent days. But the real problem was recorded as the problems in the administration, as the problem in Putin's long screw. These facts resonated all over the world. Putin is now in a position where he cannot even stand up at his rallies. It turned out that Putin was sent to a differential region from the Kremlin for treatment. Putin, who wanted to run the administration from outside the Kremlin, made a mess of everything in this regard, and Putin's world started to be done by the bureaucrats around him. This is thought to have played a major role in Russia's political instability and many problems, such as the defeat by Ukraine. Because Putin was not seen as a leader who would make such hot moves against Ukraine, instead of Putin, who acted very cold-blooded and assuring and avoided moves that would put Russia in trouble. We see a Putin who has made a lot of mistakes and succumbed to his arrogance in recent days. As a result, the victory of the Ukrainian army against the Russians is expected to deepen, but a very big problem has been revealed in Russia. Putin's bureaucrats don't know where to run. A large number of protesters in Russia have started collecting signatures, arguing that the war against Ukraine is irrational and that a peace decision should be made in this area. This signatures exceeded 2 million in about a week, but Putin started to ignore these signatures. This only served to undermine trust in Putin. If this continues, it is expected that the people will ask Putin from power in a very short time. The anti-war protesters have turned Moscow into a firestorm. It is only a matter of time before things get even more complicated. Putin has ruled Russia single-handedly for near 30 years. Everyone around him has been complicit in Putin's crimes and war crimes. In the event of regime change, Putin is expected to be put on trial, and many international courts have ordered his arrest. These decisions also meant that a large number of bureaucrats in Putin's circle would also be put on trial. That's why each of the teams with the most influence in Russia's governance has started to take steps to counter this. Because if Putin falls, many of their networks will be depleted and they will have to face the danger of being prosecuted. And since there is nothing Putin can do about it, the solution is to prevent Putin from falling. But the real mistake was Putin's disgraceful behavior over Ukraine. And these humiliations have become the basis for Russia to face even bigger problems. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Russian army has lost approximately 200,000 soldiers. Many tanks and airplanes have also been lost thanks to Ukraine's successful and to-the-point operations. The Russian army has been unable to breathe on Ukrainian soil. Putin, on the other hand, has not suffered a defeat in the 30 years of its rule. so he cannot take these defeats against Ukraine. If this continues, the Russian army will start to face even greater losses. And because of the moves it has made at certain points, it is only a matter of time before Ukraine has some very serious successes, especially in foreign policy. Because Putin has started to blame the Western support for Ukraine for this defeat. At the same time, he started making very harsh rhetoric and threats to each of those countries. Things became more complicated because of these moves, and the defeats against the Ukrainian army took another turn because countries all over the world started to support Ukraine to take steps against Russia because of the increase in both the quality and quantity of the support. The Ukrainian army has reached a very different point. The Russian army started to change its stance in the war because it was facing a very big problem. As a result, it is quite possible that Russia will be left with huge tensions. The comments made by war analysts on this issue resonated all over the world. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army is preparing to take very big steps against the Russians in a short time. The main reason for this is that the Ukrainian army has the quality and quantity to advance against the Russians in a short period of time with a very big victory. In a short period of time, the Ukrainian army can use the reinforcements sent for the most critical operations. And this operation could deal Putin the most unwanted blow. These blows could soon reorganize a lot of things that would increase the Ukrainian army's gains, and it could be officially declared that the Russian army has lost. Russia's losses are expected to increase in certain areas in a very short period of time, and it is possible that in the continuation of these losses, the Ukrainian army will step by step approach the necessary victory. There are a lot of developments in the east here in an attempt to bridge the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut and make the prospect of counter-offensive hopeless. Wagner forces made a series of very aggressive operations. They entered the most fortified part of the city and simultaneously tried to undercut Ukrainian forces from another side by sending a commando group to force the river and penetrate the city. Unfortunately for Russians, the commando group was completely overwhelmed by Ukrainian snipers and got quickly destroyed. Last time I told you that Russian forces made another significant push to the west in order to reach Minkivka and attack Ukrainian reserves before they launched a counterattack. I also told you that such a high concentration of Wagner units on such a narrow section of the front line allowed Ukrainians to inflict substantial losses on Russians by concentrating their artillery, mortar and aviation strikes. The freshest reports suggest that this tactic worked well because Russians did not manage to expand their control over the region further, despite the fact that Ukrainian forces retreated from 2 out of 4 checkpoints inside Orikha-Vasilyevka. Russians still have not entered these positions because of the fire from the hills. Right now, the most intense fights are taking place on the second hill north of the settlement. As you can see, the village is located deep between the hills. The change in elevation is more than 60 meters, so control over the settlement is not as important as over the highlands. Russian sources indicate that after several days of intense airstrikes, Ukrainian forces started to push back and conducted several limited counterattacks by leveraging the high ground that they hold. Because Wagner forces are so focused on their flanks, the pressure from the home of the road has been notably alleviated. If over the last several weeks, Ukrainians refrained from using it due to risk and even blew up the bridge, then now they have partially restored the bridge and used the Kremova road once again. Some military analysts are saying that it is possible that Ukrainians have imitated preparation for the counter-offensive along the Sloviansk highway and it may happen somewhere else. Or Wagner forces overstretched themselves and sustained high losses due to their urgent, aggressive response to the point where the need for the counter-offensive disappears. Other military analysts said that judging by the available information on the disposition of Ukrainian troops, the counter-offensive will likely happen at the end of March. When it comes to the city of Bakhmut itself, today it was confirmed that Wagner forces established control over the first shops of the ASM industrial complex. which means that the previous reports of clashes here were correct. The available footage indicates that Russians are controlling the territory of Vostok Marsh. The freshest reports showed that Ukrainians are extensively shelling the industrial areas under Russian control. Wagner forces are complaining that Ukrainians are shelling them non-stop, especially as they begin assaults on underground sections of the ASM complex. Such a tactic destroys Wagner's reinforcements and does not allow them to retreat to the surface of the area that they control. The Institute for the Study of War concluded that Wagner Group fighters are becoming increasingly pinned in urban areas, while Ukrainians are still in the process of reducing Wagner personnel on their own territory. They have successfully destroyed a Russian assault unit that forced the river and tried to put a wedge between the northern and southern groups of Ukrainian forces. 3 days ago, Russians started reporting that a group of special operators forced the river at night and established control over 2 streets, which is quite a lot. Their main goal was to pass the high-rise buildings and use them to provide cover for the reinforcements that would be sent to the area. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian snipers held tight control over this region, which is not that hard considering the number of high-rise buildings around. The same day a video was released by Ukrainian snipers from Bakhmut showing how they hunted down Wagner forces, highly likely exactly in this region. As a result, the latest reports confirmed that Russians lost the bridgehead, but most importantly, they lost an elite group of special operators. Overall, Wagner forces continue pursuing the most aggressive course of action where they are simultaneously betting on either breaching Ukrainian defense in a zone and rapidly taking the city or attacking Ukrainian reserves first, forcing them to pursue positional fights instead of a counter-offensive operation. This once again confirms that the Ukrainian command managed to prevent the encirclement of Bakhmut and impose beneficial for Ukrainians rules of the game, which is urban fighting. The conclusion of Russian military analysts is slowly starting to converge with the one of the Institute for the Study of War. Ukrainian forces are grinding Russian forces' best available infantry to reduce Russian forces' capability to stop any Ukrainian advances.